You've held some of your convictions your whole adult life, but there's a real question worth sitting with. Did you arrive at them, or were they handed to you, fully assembled, arguments included? That's not an accusation, it's a distinction. And it's one most people never make, because from the outside, and even from the inside, a belief and an ideology can look identical. They can sound identical. They can point at the same conclusions, cite the same authorities, and defend the same positions. But they are not the same thing, and the difference between them matters more than almost anything else in your intellectual and moral life right now. Here's the question I want to hold open for the rest of this video. By the time you're done watching, you should be able to tell, with real precision, which one you're actually holding. Not which one you think you're holding. Which one you're actually holding. That's a harder question than it sounds. Let's start somewhere unexpected. The word ideology was invented. It has a birthday, more or less, and a father. The father was a French philosopher named Antoine de Tracy. The time was the years just after the French Revolution, roughly the 1790s. The project was audacious. De Tracy wanted to create what he called a science of ideas, a systematic method for deriving correct thought from first principles, free from the distortions of habit, tradition, prejudice, and religion. If you could get the foundations right, if you could establish the correct abstract principles and apply them with sufficient rigor, you could solve any problem, political, moral, social, by reasoning your way to the answer. He called this science ideology, the science of ideas. Napoleon for a time supported the project. Then he turned on it viciously. He used the word ideologues as a slur, these abstract theorists who thought they could govern a nation from a philosophy seminar. Men who knew ideas but had never governed, never built, never held territory against an enemy, never administered a harvest. What's remarkable is that Napoleon's contempt and de Tracy's ambition both illuminate the same thing. Ideology was always a top-down project. It was always the attempt to arrive at correct conclusions by deduction from principles, before you had lived enough to know whether those principles actually held. I'm telling you this not as a history lesson. I'm telling you this because the word itself tells you what you're dealing with. An ideology is not simply a set of political preferences. It's a structure. It's a way of holding ideas, deduced from above, received as a package, portable in a way that lived experience never is. That structure is what matters. And that's where a thinker named Michael Oakeshott comes in. Oakeshott was a British philosopher who spent most of his career at the London School of Economics. And his most important collection of essays, Rationalism in Politics, was published in 1962. He is not a household name, but the distinction he drew in that book is one of the most practically useful ideas in modern philosophy. And almost nobody outside academic circles has ever heard of it. He called it the difference between technical knowledge and practical knowledge. Technical knowledge is knowledge you can write down. It lives in books, in manuals, in courses, in the seminar you can finish in a weekend. It can be stated explicitly, transmitted without direct contact, received by someone who has never done the thing. A recipe is technical knowledge. A rulebook is technical knowledge. A doctrinal statement is technical knowledge. You can hand it to a stranger and they will have it. Practical knowledge is different in kind, not just in degree. It lives in the hands of the practitioner, in the judgment of the person who has done the thing 10,000 times, in the marriage of two people who have navigated 30 years of the same kitchen, in the faith of someone who has sat with grief and returned to prayer anyway, not because the doctrine said to, but because they didn't know what else to do and found, in that not knowing, something real. You cannot fully write practical knowledge down, not because it's mystical, but because it's embedded. It lives in the doing, in the relationship, in the accumulated texture of a life. Michael Polanyi, a philosopher of science who was thinking about exactly this problem at roughly the same time as Oakeshott, put it in 4 words. We know more than we can tell. That sentence deserves to sit for a moment. We know more than we can tell. The craftsman knows more about wood than he can explain to an apprentice in words alone. The experienced pastor knows more about grief than any seminary course can transmit. The grandmother knows more about how to hold a family together than any family science textbook can capture. None of that knowledge is lesser for being inarticulate. It's inarticulate because it runs deeper than articulation can reach. Now, what does this have to do with belief and ideology? A genuine belief in Oakeshott's terms, is a form of practical knowledge applied to how life should be lived. It has an origin. It came from somewhere particular. A father who showed you what it meant to keep your word, even when it cost him. A moment in a church that wasn't scheduled or choreographed, when something broke open. A marriage that taught you, slowly and without announcement, that love is less a feeling than a practice. A failure that reorganized what you thought mattered. Genuine belief is particular before it is general. It arises from the specific, from what you have seen, endured, built, and lost, and only afterward reaches toward general principles. The general principles are real, but they are downstream of the experience that gave rise to them. This is why, if someone asks you to defend a deep conviction, you will often find yourself reaching for a story before you reach for a syllogism. You tell them about the moment, the person, the year. That's not a failure of reasoning. That's the signature of practical knowledge. The conviction is real enough that it has roots you can point to. An ideology moves in the opposite direction. It begins with the general, with the abstract principles, the systematic framework, the complete doctrinal architecture, and works downward toward application. And here is the alarming part. It doesn't require you to have lived anything in particular to receive it. It arrives as a package. The conclusions come with the arguments already attached. The enemies are already identified. The counter-arguments have been pre-refuted. This makes ideology extremely efficient. You can be fluent in it very quickly. You can defend it in a conversation before you've ever actually inhabited the thing it claims to describe. And that efficiency is exactly the problem. Think about a moment, and I suspect you have one. When a conversation in your church or your civic organization or your family circle shifted register. When the people around you, people you knew and trusted, started speaking in cadences that felt borrowed, the same phrases, the same sequence of points, the same pre-loaded responses to the same objections. Not because they were dishonest, but because something had arrived from a media ecosystem, from a political movement, from an online community that had handed them a complete system, pre-assembled, and they had accepted it because it pointed at conclusions they already held. The conclusions were familiar. The architecture was new, and something in you, maybe you couldn't name it at the time, registered the difference. The conviction had become a position. The living thing had been repackaged. That recognition wasn't paranoia. It wasn't disloyalty. It was the perception of a real change in kind, not just an emphasis. You were noticing that practical knowledge had been converted into technical knowledge, that the belief, which had roots in lived experience, had been extracted from those roots and translated into a transmissible doctrine. C.S. Lewis saw something structurally similar from a different angle. In The Abolition of Man, he described what happens when a civilization trains people to reason from abstract principles rather than from cultivated moral sentiment, what he called the chest, the trained intuitions that make a person capable of genuine virtue rather than merely correct calculation. His warning was that you can produce people who can argue any position fluently and inhabit none of them. People who know what they should feel without feeling it, who know what they should believe without the belief having any real grip on them. An ideologist is Lewis's man without a chest, fluent, persuasive, systematically correct. And somewhere, underneath the system, something important is absent. Before I go further, if what I'm describing is opening up more questions than one video can answer, there's a resource I put together for exactly this. It's called the Navigator's Toolkit, 12 Oakeshott Concepts for Modern Life. Each concept gets a plain language definition, a contemporary example from the domains the channel covers, faith, family, marriage, legacy, politics, and a short application guide so the concept becomes a tool, not just a term. The link is in the description. Now, here are 3 warning signs that a belief is converted into an ideology. I said I'd give you the biggest one at the end, and I will. But the first 2 are worth recognizing on their own. The first, you can state the complete position with arguments, counter-arguments, and enemies named. But when you reach for the experience that gave rise to it, you find yourself grasping. The conclusion is vivid, the origin is faint. You know what you believe in the way you know a fact you read somewhere, rather than in the way you know something you lived through. The second, the position arrived as a package, not as a slow accumulation of your own encounters with the question, but as a delivered system from a book, a podcast, a movement, a media personality that handed you the framework and the enemy simultaneously. There's nothing inherently wrong with learning from others. That's what tradition is. The difference is whether you received it as an inheritance to inhabit or as a manual to deploy. Both of these are worth sitting with, honestly. But neither is the biggest warning sign. The biggest one is this: you feel more defensive of the system than you do of the people and experiences that the system is supposed to be about. Let me say that again, because it's easy to slide past. If someone challenges your position, challenges the political or theological framework you've been operating inside, and your first move is to defend the system, the doctrine, the ideological architecture, rather than to point to what it's actually protecting, who it's actually serving, what experience gave rise to it, then the system has become the thing, rather than the means to protect a thing. That is the clearest sign that the living belief has been replaced by a shell. And here is where the real inversion happens. Here is the thing this whole video has been building toward. We tend to assume, most of us do, without examining the assumption, that the most articulate, the most systematic, the most rhetorically sophisticated defenders of a tradition are the most serious holders of it. That if you can argue for conservative Christianity with complete fluency, if you have the framework fully assembled, the objections pre-answered, the counter-traditions mapped, you are the real thing, and the person who stammers and reaches for stories is the naive one. Oakeshott's analysis reverses this entirely. The person who can give you the complete system, fully portable, transmissible to a stranger in an afternoon, that person has performed a conversion. They have taken practical knowledge and rendered it as technical knowledge. And what gets lost in that conversion is precisely the part that was real. The grandmother who can't quite explain why she believes what she believes, who reaches for a kitchen, a Sunday morning, a deathbed, a year of hard provision, who says, "I just know this is true. I've seen it work. I've seen what happens when it doesn't," is closer to the living thing than the person who can diagram the whole doctrine on a whiteboard. The inarticulate is not the naive. In Oakeshott's account, the inarticulate is the signature of the real. The inability to fully systematize a conviction is evidence that the conviction still has roots. Roots don't translate into bullet points, they just hold. This doesn't mean system and argument have no place. Of course they do. Every tradition has always needed people who can think carefully about the principles at stake. But there is a difference between using the framework to understand and protect something living and mistaking the framework for the living thing itself. When the framework becomes the thing, when winning the argument matters more than protecting what the argument was originally about, you've crossed into ideology. And ideology, history shows, is portable in both directions. A person who holds their convictions ideologically can be repackaged. The system can be swapped out for a better system, one with more sophisticated arguments or more compelling enemies. What you can't easily replace is the lived thing. You can't manufacture the grandmother's knowledge from a textbook. You can only inherit it, or lose it. So here is what you now have words for. A belief is practical knowledge applied to how life should be lived. It has an origin in lived experience, particular before it is general, and it carries marks of the life it came from. The people, the failures, the recoveries, the things you couldn't have predicted and couldn't have planned for. You know it the way you know something that happened to you. An ideology is the conversion of that living thing into a transmissible system. It arrives as a package. It is efficient, articulate, and portable. And in making belief portable, it removes the thing that made belief grip. The rootedness in something that cost you something, that formed you rather than merely informing you. The 3 tests are yours now. Apply them without contempt for yourself. This isn't a confession ritual. It's a diagnostic. Most people who absorb ideology do so because they're trying to protect something real. The question is whether the protection has become the thing, and the real thing has quietly stepped out. What remains when you run that test honestly is worth knowing. It might be smaller than the system suggested, but it will be yours, and something that is genuinely yours. Even inarticulate, even partial, even carrying the scars of how you came to hold it, is more durable than the most complete ideology ever assembled in a seminar room. Oakeshott called what conservatism actually is, at its best, before it gets packaged, a disposition, not a program, not a platform. A settled way of being in the world that prefers what is known and working to what is abstract and untested. A preference for the familiar, an attachment to what has actually proven itself. in the lives of actual people over actual time. A disposition is exactly what ideology cannot be. You can't hand a disposition to a stranger. You can only live it long enough that it lives in you. And the question that stays, the one I'd leave with you without trying to answer it here, is this. In the things that matter most to you, what are you actually defending? The system that describes it, or the thing itself? If there was a moment when a conviction you'd held for decades started to feel more like a position, something you'd been handed rather than arrived at, I'd be glad to hear when that was.